All praises for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who is the Lord of the universe, our Khaliq, our Creator, our Malik. Infinite prayers and salutations be upon our Master, the best of mankind, the coolness of our eyes, the one who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent as Khatamun Nabiyeen, the final prophet after whom there cannot be any new prophet. The one who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent, the one who is called Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam on the earth, and the one who is called Ahmad in the heavens. This month of Safar al-Muzaffar is a month in which we remember some of the greatest ulama kiram, some of the greatest awliya kiram, salihin and mujaddideen of this ummah. And from the mujaddideen to have nisbah to this blessed month, one of the names is the Imam of the Ahl Sunnah, Ala Hazrat Imam Ahmad Khan radiyallahu ta'ala an. I have been traveling to various towns and places to deliver lectures about the life and legacy of this great Imam. You see, the sad reality is that for many years we have been listening to the same talking points being regurgitated about the life of this Imam, and to the extent that before people even attend an event dedicated to this Imam's life, usually they already know the topics and the points that are going to be discussed. But this Imam is so versatile. He wrote on so many different topics that much of the knowledge that he imparted hasn't even been looked at. The sad reality is that more often than not, speakers, when they speak about the life and legacy of this Imam, they are more concerned with sound bites that feed the ego of an already converted audience than actually imparting the intellectual legacy of this Imam onto others. Therefore, it's my honor and pleasure to join you today to speak on a topic that's very rarely discussed in relation to this great Imam. And it's a topic that's, because this topic is so rarely discussed by our ulama, what it's allowed for is for that space to be filled with several misconceptions and the spread of false allegations against Imam Ahmad Khan that he is in fact free from. The topic that Shaykh has particularly asked me to speak about is Ala Hazrat radiyallahu ta'ala's thought and legacy in relation to colonialism, politics and jihad. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala enable me to speak the truth and for you to hear the truth. See, Imam Ahmad Khan radiyallahu ta'ala, he is accepted as the Mujaddid of the last century, which we all know. But we need to understand that Mujaddid does not just revive the religious condition of the Muslims. Yes, Imam Ahmad Khan was an alim and a mufti of the highest caliber, but he was also a visionary for the revival of the social, economic and political condition of the Muslims of his time. He was a social reformer, he was an economist, he was an educationist, he was also a political theorist. This is because as a mujaddid, he understood that a true religious revival requires a foundation of social, economic and political advancement to create a fertile environment in which faith can flourish, communities can prosper, and the ummah can stand with dignity and strength amidst the challenges of that time and beyond. He, rahimahullah, lived at a time that was a significant turning point in history. He was born in the year 1856 Gregorian, which on the day, Islamic date of 10th of Shawwal, which corresponds to 1272 Hijri. And he passed away in the year 1921, which corresponds on the date of 25th of Safar, which corresponds to 1340 Hijri. He lived in a city in India called Bareilly, which is now in the Indian state of Uttar Pradesh. And the region that he was from was a vibrant center of Islamic intellectual activity for over 3 centuries. His lifetime coincided with a period of profound political decline in the Muslim world. For centuries, Muslims held a position of strength and influence in India. From the establishment of the Delhi Sultanate in 1206 Muslim rulers, although a minority, governed a vast Hindu majority. But it was truly under the Mughal Empire, which lasted for just around 3.5 centuries, that Muslim power reached its peak. The Mughals built around them a multi-regional empire that stretched across the Indian subcontinent. And under the Mughals, the GDP of Mughal India was estimated to be around 22% of the world economy in the year 1600. India, under the rule of the Mughals, was the second largest economy after Ming China. And the economy of India was significantly larger than that of Europe's. Mughal India was also a global leader in manufacturing, contributing approximately 25% of the world's industrial output. Likewise, agricultural production flourished. Scientific development and innovation flourished under the Mughals. This was a time of also educational equity. There was a rapid establishment of educational establishments that provided education not just to the Muslims of that time, but also Hindus alike. And then under the rule of the Emperor Aurangzeb, the Muslims of India saw developments in Islamic scholarship, such as the codification of Hanafi fiqh in the form of Fatawa al-Mughiri, the development of Dars-e-Nizami curriculum, both of which remain influential for the ulama of today. But after the death of this Emperor Aurangzeb, the condition of the Muslims started to deteriorate. Costly wars, internal divisions, the rise of other indigenous religious groups like the Sikhs and the Hindus caused Muslim power to chip away. The Mughal emperor became little more than just a ceremonial figure. And into this vacuum stepped the British in the form of the East India Company, who first arrived as traders but saw very quickly an opportunity in the fractured politics of post-Mughal India. Then a turning point came in the year 1751 at the Battle of Plassey, a victory made possible only by the betrayal within the Nawab's own army. Mir Jafar, the commander-in-chief of the army of the Nawab of Bengal, along with others, secretly schemed with the British, asking for support to overthrow the Nawab in return for being installed in his place. From there, the East India Company expanded rapidly, annexing various different territories of the Mughal Empire and installed puppet leaders across. In 1784 then, Pitt's India Act placed company rule directly under the British government's control. A clear sign of the imperial ambition, the colonial ambition of the British government for India. And then finally, after the failed First Indian War of Independence in 1857, which the British titled as either the rebellion or the mutiny, after this, the last Mughal emperor, Bahadur Shah Zafar, he was deposed and exiled. The East India Company was dissolved and India came directly under the control of the British Crown. What we saw as initially economic engagement then became total political control, the complete colonization of India. And interestingly, when we look at the colonization of India, we see striking comparisons and parallels to the colonization of Palestine that evolved roughly around the same time. We see in both places the British entered through the cover of protection or modernization, as if to say that their rule was somehow a favor upon the people that they were colonizing. In India, the British East India Company initially entered through the guise of trade, protection of allies, and civilization missions. The narrative that was portrayed was that we are entering these lands to bring civilization, as if civilization hadn't already existed there before. Gradually, these commercial footholds were transformed into complete political and military domination. And we saw the same in the case of Palestine too. The British came through the League of Nations mandate after World War I. Officially, this was to prepare the land for self-governance, but effectively to serve the imperial interests and facilitate the Zionist settlement of Palestine. Likewise, in India, we saw the economic restructuring for purely imperial benefit. The economy was reorientated to serve Britain's industrial needs, with raw materials being exported and British manufactured goods being imported, undermining local industries. And this was also the case in Palestine. British policies, they favored Zionist economic institution, modern agricultural colonies, and infrastructure that tied the economy to British and Zionist markets, which ultimately marginalized Arab economic growth. And one of the key elements and instruments of colonization was also the control of resistance that took place through militarization. You see, the British responded in India to 1857, the first war of independence, with overwhelming force, with brutality. There were mass executions. And a notable case is the example of Mawlana Khairabadi. He was a notable leader of the 1857 War of Independence. He was, as a result, arrested by the British for issuing a fatwa against their rule. And then he was imprisoned in the Andaman Islands, where he was ultimately martyred in 1861. Likewise, in Palestine, we saw the British violently suppressing the Arab revolt, using house demolitions, mass arrests, and collective punishments, techniques which are now being adopted by Israel. And these are all adopted by Israel through the lessons and teachings that they gained from the colonization of that land by the British. Also, another parallel between both lands is the use of puppets and traitors who worked against the interests of Muslims. You see, the British in India worked with local princes, landlords, and officials who collaborated in suppressing any uprisings and maintaining their colonial control, often in the exchange of titles, wealth, or political favor. And we already mentioned the example of Mir Jafar, who the name Mir Jafar in the Urdu language now is used as a description to describe anyone who is seen as treacherous. And in Palestine, the British also relied on Arab elites who cooperated with the British authorities and undermined any nationalist movements or any uprisings against colonial rule. And we see this even today. That even today, the colonization of Palestine is being maintained and sustained through the colonial project that is Israel, through the work of puppet Arab leaders who are the Mir Jafars of today. And this trend continues even in the diaspora, where Muslims are living as minorities in the West. We have so-called leaders who are on the government payroll and bootlickers in support of whatever the government of that day is saying, ultimately to suppress Muslim voices. The case in point is the genocide of the murder of our brothers and sisters in Gaza that is taking place. Where are these Muslim leaders and so-called community leaders in voicing the opposition to them? In fact, when Keir Starmer said that Israel was within their right to cut off water and power and food to the people of Gaza, it's these very same so-called community leaders, who so-called ulama, who are there to shake hands with Keir Starmer and very ready to brush shoulders with him for community iftars, etc. You see, it's our obligation to follow the law of the land, but it's not our obligation to follow the whims and the agenda of the government of the day. There's a distinction between that. We must follow the law of the land, we be abiding citizens of the law of the land, but that does not mean to say that we nod our heads to everything that the government of that time says. And quite often, we find that many of these community leaders or so-called ulama who are propagating support of the government, they have titles such as MBE and OBE attached to the names. You see, before anyone is given any of these supposed honors, they must go through a vetting system where they are tested for their obedience to the government. It is the government of that day who gives these supposed honors based on how obedient these people have been to them. we are not required to obey any government and their whims, but we are required to obey the law of the land. But ultimately, we should not be obedient to the whims of any of these governments and their agendas, but ultimately be obedient to Allah and His Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And this, going on to specifically onto my topic, was the political philosophy of Imam Ahmad Raza Khan. What was his answer to colonialism? With the onset of colonialism, questions began to be asked amongst the ulama on the territorial status of India under colonialism. See, prior to Imam Ahmad Raza Khan radiallahu an, Shah Abdul Aziz Dehlwi radiallahu an, who was the son of Shah Waliullah Muhaddis Dehlwi, both giants of scholarship. Shah Abdul Aziz is considered to be the Mujaddid of the 13th century. He designated the lands ruled by the East India Company as Darul Harb. The designation of a land as either Darul Harb or Darul Islam has significant legal consequences for the permissibility of jihad, the taking, giving of interest, and many other muamalat. However, his fatwa was in a very specific economic context without any specific political intent. Much later, it was employed in the context of intensified antagonism with the British post 1857, post the War of Independence. For instance, the Khilafat movement which was a pan-Islamic movement launched by Indian Muslims in support of the Ottoman Empire. At the same time, they advocated for non-cooperation with the British. So out of this movement came out the Hijra movement. This was led by individuals such as Abul Kalam Azad, who issued a fatwa that since India was now Darul Harb, based on Shah Abdul Aziz's fatwa, it's incumbent on Muslims to either wage jihad against the British, and if that's not possible, then to perform hijrah, to migrate to the nearest Darul Islam, which at the time was Afghanistan. They used Shah Abdul Aziz's fatwa as the justification for their case. However, this was a misinterpretation of Shah Abdul Aziz's fatwa, because in no part did he in his fatwa actually advocate for migration from India in this period. What happened instead as a result was a tragic consequence for those who followed them. Many died performing this hijrah, this migration, and many ended up returning to India because the life in Afghanistan was not as they had been promised. The Shah of Afghanistan, who welcomed them with open arms and made many promises to welcome the Muslims of India, many of those promises did not see reality. And when those Muslims faced those harsh realities in Afghanistan and returned back to India, what ended up happening was that the property and the assets that they had left, they were not able to buy back. Which is why Imam Ahmad Raza Khan opposed the Hijra movement, because he saw it as a ploy of the Hindus. He said that it was a ploy set up by the Hindus that when the Muslims leave and sell their asset, their land very cheaply, they would be able to take possession of these assets. He warned that the masajid, mosques, and Muslim graveyards will be desecrated. Muslim women and children who would be left behind, and they would be persecuted. And Imam Ahmad Raza Khan radiallahu ta'ala, according to the understanding of the Hanafi madhab, he categorically ruled that India under colonialism was still Darul Islam and not Darul Harb. He argued that according to the principles of the Hanafi school, based on the opinion of Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah and the Sahibain, Imam Muhammad and Imam Abu Yusuf. They all agreed that one condition that would render Darul Islam to be Darul Harb was that the laws of shirk would be publicly and officially endorsed, and not a single law of Islam would remain implemented. It's under that condition that Darul Islam would transition into Darul Harb. Based on that principle, Imam Ahmad Raza Khan radiallahu ta'ala, he argued that this was not the case in India. And he gave a list of practices in his fatwa on this issue, that Muslims in India were still permitted to perform the Friday prayer. They were still permitted to perform the Eid prayer, the adhan, the call to prayer, congregational prayers in the masajid, and other marks of Sharia were still permitted publicly within India, although this was no longer Muslim rule. And he also lists other examples such as inheritance laws, marriage, divorce, the rules of iddah, and many other matters of muamalat was still settled and adjudicated according to Islamic law. And in matters relating to the Muslims, the British colonialists would still approach ulama for fatwa in how to deal with the matters of the Muslims. So on this basis, he ruled that India was not Dar al-Harb, but it remained Dar al-Islam. However, he faced significant backlash from his opponents. His fatwa, despite the opposition he received from his opponents, was far more categorical than that of his opponents. The fatwas of his opponents were contradictory. If we look at the fatwa of Qasim Nanodwi, he considered India to be Dar al-Harb for the purpose of performing hijrah, but Dar al-Islam when it came to the dealings of interest transactions. If we look at Rashid Ahmad Gangohi, in 1898, he was pledging loyalty to the British Crown. He called himself an obedient servant of the Sarkar, of the government. Shibli Nomani of the Nadwa movement, who again, a harsh critic of Imam Ahmad Raza Khan, he advised Muslims to remain loyal to their leaders, to the rulers, the British at the time. Yet it is these very same people who threw mud and accused Imam Ahmad Raza Khan of being a British agent. My response to this in a nutshell is that those in glass houses shouldn't be throwing stones. If at one particular work by a figure of the Ahl Hadith movement, Maulvi Ahsan Ilahi Zahir, he wrote a work called Al-Barelawiyya. And in this work, he also leveled this accusation about Imam Ahmad Raza Khan rahimahullah being a British agent. And this allegation can be answered in three ways. The first being that when examining the allegation that Imam Ahmad Raza Khan is a British agent, we must begin with a fundamental principle. What's that? That the burden of proof always lies with the accuser. And it's not enough simply to make an accusation, one must provide the evidences. So what does the evidence say? Let's ask a series of questions. Can anyone show a single instance recorded by Imam Ahmad Raza himself or his admirers where he was invited by an officer or any official of the British government? Can anyone demonstrate that he has ever received a grant, a pension, or any kind of financial assistance from the British? Or is there any record that he met with a British officer? That he ever visited the home of an Englishman, a representative of the British government, or anyone representing the British government visited him in his home? And if such examples cannot be provided, then let us ask further. Can anyone show us a single passage where Imam Ahmad Raza Khan rahimahullah, in his writings or his poetry, praised the British or their rule? The answer to every single one of these is a resounding no. No evidence of the sort exists. And if, as Ahsan Ilahi Zahir suggests, that ruling India at the time to be Dar al-Islam and not calling for jihad against the British made someone a British agent, then that same accusation can be leveled at scholars from his own sect. So let's look at some of their writings. Ismail Dehlvi, who was the intellectual father of the Ahlul Hadith and the Deobandi movements, he was the one who is regarded as the spread of the Wahabi movement in the Indian subcontinent. He said that in no way is jihad against the British wajib. In fact, if someone does attack them, then it is further upon the Muslims to fight against that person and not let them attack our government, he says. And if there's any proof to suggest that any sect was supported by the British or was an agent of the British, then the weight of evidence suggests that it was perhaps the Ahl Hadith movement and the Deobandi movements that were. You see, alongside other groups, they were propped up and supported by the British government at the time. Ismail Dehelvi's work, Taqwiyat al-Iman, which in reality is a copycat work of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab's Kitab al-Tawheed. See, this is often regarded as the Urdu duplicate of Kitab al-Tawheed. In this work, Ismail Dehelvi declares the majority of the Muslims of his time as being mushrikeen. He declares the majority of Muslims at the time of being engaged in bid'ah and shirk. Now, this book, during the period of colonization, was translated into English. An unheard precedent at the time. It was patronized by the British colonialists as an instrument of divide and conquer to corrupt the love of the Prophet ﷺ in the hearts of Muslims. See, the British government in 1837 funded the printing of this work. They patronized it and supported its free distribution across the Indian subcontinent. So, if there's no clearer proof of collusion and support of British colonialism, then there's no better case than this. There's no proof, however, of that same sort of support being given to Imam Ahmad Raza. He is free from this accusation. And the third way that we can counter this accusation is by both looking at Imam Ahmad Raza's personal actions and his writings on whether he actively resisted British rule or whether he was in support of it. In actual fact, what we see in his writings, that he had an innate hatred for British colonialism. It's notable of Imam Ahmad Raza that he would resist the authority of the British monarch and British colonialism by placing the stamp with the head of Queen Victoria upside down when he would post his letters. This was seen by colonialists as a mark of treason and mutiny. And also, if any judicial proceedings were brought against him, he never recognized British courts and rule or its judicial system. He would refuse to attend any British court. And if we look at his fatwa, his disdain for the British was such that once he was asked a question that, is it permissible to eat with the British? He responds by saying that it's not permissible to eat with the Christians, especially the British. Nor should you eat any food with them, nor you should drink any water with them, neither. He considered their cooking utensils, to be full of impurities. And he says that even if in their kitchen they had a Muslim cook, then the meat that he cooks is impure. This is a level of disdain that he had for the British. And this was his way of demonstrating resistance against the British at the time. And in another place, Imam Ahmad Raza was asked his view on whether Muslims can join the British army. And perhaps this is a lesson for us in this country. He was asked whether Muslims can join the British army when they are required to fight against fellow Muslims like the Turks or the Arabs or the Afghans. You see, if he was a British agent, as he was accused, he would have immediately said yes, it's permissible. Instead, what does he reply? Imam Ahmad Raza replies that yes, killing a fellow Muslim is one thing, but even if one kills a kafir non-Muslim without a valid reason, then that would be unlawful and haram. Imam Ahmad Raza here enunciates his view of the British army as being tyrannical, of being a brutal army, that by joining the British army means you'll be killing innocent people. It doesn't matter whether those lives are Muslims or not Muslims. To join such an unjust army like the British army would be categorically haram. This was the ruling of Imam Ahmad Raza rahimahullah. Is this the sign of somebody who is a British agent? Quite clearly not. And I will finish by summarizing his view on jihad. Imam Ahmad Raza did not declare jihad upon the British at the time. That's clear. But that does not mean that he was opposed to jihad or that he was against resistance to the British. In 1912, one of his works was published, a booklet titled Tadbir Falah wa Najat wa Islah, the plan for prosperity, salvation and reform. And in this, he presented a case for the economic resistance against the British of the time. He presented his economic vision. And if you want to listen to the details of this, then please look up my lecture last week that I delivered in Bradford, where I detailed the economic revival, the case of economic revival that Imam Ahmad has presented. But in any case, he was not against jihad. In his Fatawa Razawiyya, he presents the necessary conditions for declaring jihad. It's a misconception and a false accusation against the Sufiya that they were against jihad. In actual fact, some of the greatest examples in our Islamic history of mujahideen are those that are Sufis. For instance, in the army of Sultan Salahuddin Ayyubi, the army that liberated Al-Quds, the vast majority of that army, those soldiers were Qadiris. In some shape or form, they were disciples or students that were linked to Sheikh Abdul Qadir al-Jilani. Those who liberated Masjid al-Aqsa were those who were upon the teachings of Al-Ghawth al-Azam. Another example is Imam Shamil, the Naqshbandi Sheikh, who resisted the suppression of the Russians. We have the example of Umar al-Mukhtar. He opposed Italian occupation of Libya. He was a Sanusi Sufi. You have Amir Abdul Qadir al-Qadiri. He was a Sufi who led the resistance against the French in Algeria. You have, we already mentioned the name Imam Fazli al-Khairabadi, a Sufi who was a leader of the 1857 War of Independence and resistance against the British. You see, Sufis have always been at the forefront of resistance against oppression and colonialism. In contrast, those who say that Sufis are peace-loving, pacifist people and Sufis oppose jihad, they are spreading lies. Sufis and Imam Ahmad Raza Khan radiallahu anh is no different. Have always been propagating resistance to colonial forces. In contrast, those who level the accusation that Sufis do not oppose colonialism and do not propagate resistance, often from the Wahhabi Najdi movement, their so-called shaheeds have never conducted jihad against the kuffar, but only murdered and killed fellow Muslims. And this was the case of Ismail Dehlvi and Sayyid Ahmad of Rai Barelvi, who are revered by the followers as shaheed. They claim that they died whilst on jihad against the Sikhs of the northwest frontier province of India. But the truth is that they set off to murder fellow Muslims that they considered to be mushriki. And they were killed in a battle by the Pakhtun, by the Pathans of the northwest frontier of India. And this has been the case of the pseudo-Salafis across history. They've only ever engaged in warfare against fellow Muslims, whether that is Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, or whether it's Al-Qaeda, or whether it's ISIS. And even today, if we wait for the pseudo-Salafis to declare jihad for the liberation of Palestine, we will be waiting, but that time will never come. The liberation of Palestine and the liberation of Masjid al-Aqsa can only come when it is the Ahl Sunnati wal Jama'ah that wakes up from its sleep. And this is the lessons that we learn from the Sufiya when it comes to resisting colonialism, when it comes to politics, and when it comes to jihad, which is an obligation. It has never been the case of the Sufis, and Imam Ahmad Raza Khan is a reflection of that, that wherever there has been tyranny, wherever there has been oppression and colonialism, it's the Sufiya that have risen against it. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept our gathering here today. If there's anything good that I have said, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept it. All good is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, all bad is from me. Wa akhiru da'wana, and alhamdulillahi rabbil alamin.